Okay, how's everybody today? Today we've got Fed watching. Adam, is it you that's stopping to talk to me? Somebody stopped to talk to me.
Oh, that was me.
What's your name again?
I was Christian. I was supposed to go Monday.
You're supposed to go Monday. Is Adam here? All right, you brought something for today?
Yep, that's another thing.
Okay, good. I'm gonna let Adam go first. All right, what do you have for us, Adam?
Basically an article about how aggressively we should increase the interest rates, mostly in March. And a bunch of the Federal Reserve presidents across the country have different opinions on how we should raise those. And I believe it was the Federal Reserve of St. Louis president. He's saying that a large increase is something that we should do, even though it's something that we usually only use in case of emergencies. And a bunch of other presidents across the country was basically telling him that was a bad idea, and that it needs to be more of a measured and slow and steady increase over time.
Okay, you got any takes on that?
I feel like one big increase that the St. Louis president was talking about probably isn't going to be the greatest of ideas, because that's something that in the past has kind of caused a little bit of harm to the economy. That's what the article says. What I think the president of San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank said.
Okay, so a big shock, right, might cause more disruptions than a gradual shift, right? Now, it's interesting. Would you rather okay, so some of you were spanked when you were kids, and maybe it's inappropriate to talk about it, but oh well, right? Would you rather get 3 swats for hitting your sister or be grounded from video games for a month? All right. No solutions, there's only trade-offs. All right. Some of us would prefer the quick and overdone with kind of solution, right? Some of us would, I don't care about video games that much, I'll just go play basketball outside instead, right? And maybe that's what the parent was trying to direct you to do anyhow, right? But for it to be more effective, they might have to up the quantity of swats to actually get you to go outside and play basketball. So it's interesting. Now, it's not like we're being punished by the Fed. It's not like we're not being punished by the Fed, but it's not like the Fed is being punished by its own behaviors. But it's interesting. It's interesting that it's happening in public, though. That's important, right? That these members of the Federal Reserve Board are talking about it in public. That's very helpful. It helps to increase the democratic access to the members of the Fed who are making these kinds of decisions. But they're still not necessarily receiving feedback from consumers. They're probably mostly receiving feedback from other bankers. So they're insulated from direct influence. Thank you. Okay, who else had news today? You did, Christian?
Yeah. I'm not sure if this is the same article that he was talking about, but this one kind of was leading into some of the interest rate stuff as well. But it started off like saying, because of all the stimulus and all the like basically grants we've been given, like we're causing higher inflation, and so the Fed wants to start selling some of its bonds from like its $9 trillion portfolio to like kind of pull some of the money back off the, or like out of the market. And then talked about raising interest rates, but they wanted to do it more of a gradual and slow approach after trying to sell some of these bonds.
Okay, so quicker or slow is the idea. Again, right? These high efficiency photos are a little bit of a hassle to me because I gotta download them. They don't open easily. Just for everybody else for future information.
There's one in there.
Here's the Ukraine.
Yep. The Ukraine.
What's that about?
That's talking about all the implications with Russia and Ukraine and how big of a part of like the oil industry that Russia is and them pulling or like withholding their exports could have on the rest of the world, because like I think they said they produce like 12% of the world's crude oil and like 10% of like actual finished products.
What does happen if prices of oil go up? Particularly in America, what happens in America if the price of oil goes up? We frack more.
Yeah, that was the end of it. It said like they're expanding the amount of
Fracking
machines
and
that they
oil
have.
exploration in America, right? Yeah, if the price of oil goes up too high, the United States becomes a net exporter of oil, which is kind of funny. Especially since like my entire childhood was always, oh, we're importing too much oil. It's because it was so cheap to import oil from other places. When other places raise the prices, we become a net exporter. Now, it does cost everybody in America a lot of money to buy whatever it is they have to buy as part of oil, right? A lot of oil is used in a lot of things, but not in everything. People find alternative ways. When I teach intro to courses and talk about substitute goods, one kind of substitute that I talk about is gasoline. And you guys might remember this, I don't know. But if the price of gasoline goes up tomorrow, let's say it goes up to $6 a gallon tomorrow, right? What are you gonna do in response? Immediately, you're gonna pay for the gasoline. You need to get wherever it is you need to go. But the longer that price change stays in effect, the more likely it is that you find substitutes. So instead of driving, you might ride the bus or ride your bike or walk. And my favorite example is you might buy a bigger freezer. Why would you buy a bigger freezer?
That's true.
Fewer trips to the grocery store, right? So the longer a price change stays in effect, the more substitutes we find for that product. So demand becomes relatively more elastic. The first law of demand is that demand slopes down. The second law of demand is that the longer a price change stays in effect, the more elastic the demand curve becomes. Okay. The third law of demand has to do with relative price ratios, and I'm going to leave that be for the time being. Okay, thank you for sharing news today. I appreciate that. Let me give this man credit. Good. What else do we have going on? I recommended that you watch the Marginal Revolution University videos on the solo growth model. Any of you get to that? Would be a review from your intro course. If you had me, it would have been chapter 8, I think, of Count Tabarrok's book. But I think it's really useful and helpful to give you a background and refresh you on what's going on with the solo growth model. Okay. Are there any other logistical kinds of questions for me today? Okay. Good. The online homeworks are going okay so far? Okay. And I need to do some grading, I know. I'm a bum. Been pretty busy with these interviewees coming in and other stuff happening. We've been talking about savings and investment in an open economy. You might want to think about, okay, suppose we're in equilibrium and savings is set exogenously and investment is a function of the interest rate. Why is the savings curve inelastic in this context? Because it is not sensitive to changes in the interest rate in this model. Why not? Well, because in Mankew's formulation of consumption is not sensitive to the interest rate. So there is presumed a marginal propensity to consume that is not sensitive to the interest rate. So it does not factor into savings. Savings is just whatever you don't buy, whatever you don't consume in a given time period. So we end up with a perfectly inelastic supply curve and a downward sloping investment curve. Suppose that expansionary fiscal policy abroad raises the world interest rate. The world interest rate is exogenous to, by definition, the domestic interest rate. If the world interest rate goes up, suppose the world interest rate had been something like this to begin with. And so we have net exports to begin with. What happens if the world interest rate goes up because of foreign expansionary fiscal policy? Foreign governments are spending more money. Why would foreign governments spending more money cause the interest rate to go up? You recall this? In order to borrow, a government has to enter into the market for loanable funds. And when entering into the market for loanable funds, right, an increase in demand for loanable funds, which is captured by the government borrowing more than it had been before, will cause the interest rate to go up. So the world interest rate goes up because the foreign country is increasing spending while not also increasing taxation. So the interest rate goes up. What happens if the foreign country is expanding their fiscal policy? Well then, net exports also grow. Why? Well, who's buying their bonds? The foreign government is increasing borrowing by selling bonds. Who's buying them?
Other countries.
Other countries. Similarly, what would happen? Starting from basic situation like this again, what happens if the demand for investment increases? Suppose that the interest rate is, above the domestic equilibrium, but then investment demand domestically increases. There's a bunch of new investment opportunities. What do we expect to happen? Well, it depends how far, actually, the investment demand goes. It could be that investment demand domestically could lead to being a net an importer. If the magnitude is simply such that that the shift just keeps it still below the world interest rate, then we would still have net exports, but they would be smaller. So it simply is, because this interest rate is set exogenous to the model, because it's including the interest rate of the world involving it, then activities within the domestic economy do not influence the world interest rate. So trade flows are impacted based upon the parts of the model within the domestic economy that can move. Okay. The next section of this chapter has us thinking about exchange rates. And again, exchange rates drive me bananas. I'm not a huge fan of thinking about exchange rates, to the point where I generally don't even teach this chapter. Okay. But an exchange rate, the real exchange rate is the relative price of domestic goods in terms of foreign goods. Right? I talked about buying a meal at KFC in the US or in China. Right? The real exchange rate is equal to the nominal exchange rate times the price in, let's call this in China, right? This is going to be in the price in the US, this is going to be the price in China. The real exchange rate is the actual ability to purchase goods in a foreign country. The nominal exchange rate messes with our understanding of things, right? It's an impedance into pure market interactions. One way to think about this actually is to think back to relative prices and how in economics we're not concerned with absolute prices but relative prices. And if we're trying to compare relative prices, we're trying to compare the relative price of a KFC meal in the US compared to the relative price of a KFC meal in China, right? And the question is, how much of all other goods do I have to give up in order to get this KFC meal, right? And if the relative price is the same, if it's a 1-for-1 ratio, right, then the nominal interest rate, is equal to the real interest rate, right? So the nominal exchange rate is equal to the real exchange rate. But if they're different, right, then the government is toying with those purchases of it. So in the real world, we can think of the real exchange rate as the relative price of a basket of domestic goods in terms of a basket of foreign goods. Now, when we put this into thinking about macroeconomics, we're not thinking about, a basket of goods. We're just thinking about GDPs, right? Homogeneous output units. So then the nominal or the real exchange rate is the relative price of one country's output in terms of the other country's output. So you might think about the basket of goods being talked about as being the CPI basket, or something like that. If the real exchange rate goes up, then US goods become more expensive relative to foreign goods. So if the real exchange rate goes up, US goods become more expensive relative to foreign goods. As a result, because US goods are more expensive relative to foreign goods, exports fall. Foreigners aren't going to want to buy more expensive products from the US. Similarly, imports rise. And Americans are going to buy the same products, but they're going to buy them from somebody who's selling it abroad because it's cheaper abroad. And so then, and that falls. The net exports falls. I'm gonna leave off on the rest of this trade stuff for now. I might come back to it. But as far as I'm concerned, these are the major moving pieces of what's going on here in this model. Anybody start on the homework for that section yet? Chapter 6 homework? Any chapter questions? All right. Is there anything else essential that I should have gotten to? Those questions that would help, that would have helped for you to get through those questions? Let's then move to a discussion of the solo growth model. And I hope to get out to you a reading or two, hopefully from Bill Easterly. Bill Easterly was at the World Bank for a long time, and my daughter's in his class this semester. I'm such a nerd, such a geek about it. I was taking his class this semester at NYU. I read his book when I was an undergraduate, so I'm near the peak geeking out over this. She says he's boring in class. I said, that's what my students say about me too. For this solo growth model, we want to start with the question about production. We want to ask, okay, what things determine production in an economy? And production, we similarly think of as in terms of GDP. And our goal is to increase not just GDP. We can increase GDP by having more babies and making them work. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those babies have a higher quality of life. Right? The real goal is an increase in real GDP per capita, as you demonstrated in your assignments. Was anybody surprised at the results of their GDP assignments? Anybody have a country state here that was like, whoa, I had no idea? So what country did you have? Anybody? Yeah.
Ireland.
You had Ireland. Okay, how does Ireland's GDP compare to the United States? Real GDP per capita.
It was more than Colorado. It was like 11,000 more, like in 2019.
Real GDP per capita was higher than Colorado's?
It was like 78,000 per person.
I'm very skeptical.
Well,
Okay. Yes?
I had Tanzania.
Tanzania.
Yeah.
Yikes.
They had a like way smaller GDP per capita than Alaska.
Okay. Yeah, way smaller, right?
Yeah, like
Was real GDP per capita above $3 a day?
I don't remember, but yeah, it was probably somewhere around there.
Probably close to that, right?
Yeah.
What biases those results is that, it includes the very wealthy in those countries, and the very poor in those countries, so you don't really get, you don't get a combined Gini coefficient with the real GDP per capita, it's an average.
Then Alaska also had like 750,000 people.
Right.
Compared to Tanzania, who has, I don't remember. how
Millions
many.
and millions.
Yeah, millions of people.
How many people live in Nigeria? Does anybody have, off the top of their mind, the population of Nigeria? Somebody look it up real quick.
$206 million.
Nigeria has 206 million people. What's the primary language in Nigeria?
English.
It's English. Okay, our population is around 340 million, give or take. If you think that you're going to win in global competition simply because you speak English, you're going to have a bad time. Right? You're going to have a bad time. Most of those people are coming online quickly and are able to work online. And they're willing to work for less than you. They have a lot of opportunities. You're going to have to continue to improve your skill set. American college students, present company excluded, of course, have gotten a little bit secure, right? And the opportunities that are available to them. But as the world continues to change, the competition is going to get more fierce. Okay, so we think about production in the economy, and going back to first principles of production, right? We say, what goes into production of stuff? Well, we've got land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial talent. Very good, okay. I always want to remind us that all these things are important in production because the models that we work with, they cut out entrepreneurial talent and land. They just say, okay, let's set those constant. It's too complicated when we do it. And variation in these two is small. So when we're trying to explain what's happening in the rest of the world, it's helpful to just focus on the two things that change the most, labor and capital. So population changes, right? And then also changes in capital. Now, if you've got a factory and you're trying to make widgets, right, you might want to buy some machines that help you to make the widgets. More machines is better, right? It depends. However, the the ability of an individual worker to be productive might increase with the quantity of machines that are available, although there will be a decreasing marginal productivity. Are you with me? A decreasing marginal productivity. And so we have an output graph that if we hold labor constant, we get a graph that looks like this. And the slope of this graph is the marginal productivity of capital at any point along this graph. Okay, how productive is capital? One way of holding labor constant is to talk about effective capital, which is simply to take the number of units of capital and divide it by the number of units of labor. And then when we do that, we are going to be talking about the amount of output per worker, given the amount of capital per worker. So our textbook does this. What's a good way to show a graph that looks like this? Right, we talked about this before, didn't we? Right? We use an exponential. Gives us this kind of graph. If you review the Count-Tabarrok videos, they simply say y equals a square root of k. Right? They just use the square root function. They magnify it by this technology term, but they basically say that it's a square root. Now that's just to help students so that they don't have to deal with different levels of exponentials. We understand that in the real economy, capital is about 0.3 and labor is about 0.7. Both are less than 1 though, so we're still going to get this basic shape from our curve. Are you with me? Okay. So we have the production. And in order to get more output, it was presumed that the only way to get more output is to increase the amount of capital. How do you get capital? Where does capital come from? We remember that on the production possibility frontier. Right? You got good X and good Y. How do we move the production possibility frontier out? Well, first, you got to tighten your belt a little bit and use some of your productive capacity instead of for consumption to produce capital goods. And then roundaboutly, we end up having a high level of overall productivity. You got to develop some capital. In other words, you got to buy capital in order to produce higher levels of output. Well, where does the capital come from? It comes from reduction in consumption. You got to decrease your overall level of consumption in order to buy capital instead. Well, how much capital are we going to buy? We're going to buy a percentage of output. We're going to take some percentage of our output and save it. This is consistent with the Keynesian marginal propensity to consume model, where consumption is some function of output minus taxes, and this is the marginal propensity to consume. You've got your disposable income after taxes. How much of that do you consume? What percentage of it do you consume? The rest of it you save. Where does savings go? Into the market for loanable funds. Okay, we're going to skip that step for the purposes of developing the solo model. Okay, we're going to say it just goes directly to the purchase of capital. What kind of capital? We're going to skip that too. Capital is homogeneous. All capital is the same in this model. Doesn't matter what kind of capital you're buying, it's going to be equally effective. Ha ha ha. Okay. So then how would we show that on this graph? We're going to want to show a savings function that is some percentage of the output function. So if the rate of savings is 30% of output, then no matter what level of output is, savings is going to be 30% of it. If output is this level, savings is going to be this percent of it. Still 30% of it. If output is at this level, 30% of it would be here. So you end up with a curve that has basically the same shape, but that is everywhere 30% of the total level of output. Are we good? Okay, so what happens? Right? You have this much capital this year. You produce this amount. You're going to save this much of it. That savings goes into the purchase of more capital. When you purchase more capital, you have a higher level of output next year. Of that output, you're going to save some of it. That savings goes into the purchase of more capital, so then next year you have higher level of output. Are you with me? Right? So we're slowly ratcheting up our overall level of production. Does that look pretty good to you? Okay, what's the opportunity cost? There's a couple of different opportunity costs. First of all, we haven't included depreciation in this model yet. Now, what's depreciation? That has to do with things wearing out. I was talking with Dayon and Owen earlier today, which is always entertaining. And Owen was talking about having bought new tires for his car. And we were teasing Owen a little bit because he spent way too much money on his tires. And then his car died. Now the tires. I got a Maserati, goes 85, I lost my license, and now I can't drive. Right? We're giving him a hard time. Owen's good for that though. Tires wear out a lot more slowly than they used to. Today you can buy tires that have an 80,000 mile warranty on them, which is incredible. That a tire would last for 80,000 miles. Usually they don't, especially in Muncie. There's a reason that the barking cow has a flavor called Delaware County pothole. Have you been there? Have you been to the barking cow? It's a good flavor too. I like it. Actually, mechanics in town are really busy in the middle of winter and in the spring because potholes are horrible and they wreck tires and they wreck suspension systems. And so mechanics get very busy in the late winter and the spring. February, it's a profit month. And for a town the size of Muncie, there's a disproportionate number of tire shops. I wonder if anybody's done a little study of that, right? What are the number of tire shops per population in the upper Midwest relative to the tire shops per population in a place like Houston, right? Probably relatively high. I wonder if controlling for the amount of miles driven on average would increase or decrease the magnitude of the results. That'd be a nice little econometric study. Any of you doing econometrics this semester? You gotta do a new project. That'd be a tidy little project. Probably not too hard to find the information for it either. Somebody's probably already done it, but you can always replicate it. Okay, so tires wear out over time, they depreciate. Your shoes wear out over time, they depreciate. Some people have so many shoes that none of them ever depreciate. Right? They just have tons and tons of shoes and none of them ever wear out, they just go out of fashion. I guess that's also a form of depreciation. Right? My leather bag has depreciated over time, such that my wife has even had to send it off for repairs. But what else depreciates? What other kinds of things depreciate? Can you give me a fun example of something that depreciates?
Combine.
A combine. A combine depreciates. Sure. How often does a new combine need to be purchased?
Depends.
Depends.
Depends on the structure. Like how many bushels it's running through it, acres. It depends.
So we can get a value for how quickly it depreciates based upon the number of bushels that's been put through it instead of over time, right?
Yeah.
Based upon on use, right? What else depreciates over time? Your jokes, Snow. You have more than one class with me, they depreciate rapidly. Part of the fun is that they're still funny the second time. Mostly because you're laughing at me, not with me. Okay. How would we show depreciation? Well, again, because we're talking about an aggregated model of the economy that basically produces GDPs using capitals, right? It's all aggregated. Right? Certain tires wear out faster than others. We're not going to assume that. We're going to assume that everything wears out at the same rate. Some jokes are better, have a longer shelf life than others, right? We're going to assume that all jokes wear out at the same rate, whether it's me or Jim Gaffigan talking about them. Is he going to keep on talking about Jim Gaffigan with this book? Is that your best Jim Gaffigan impression? So all capital depreciates at the same rate. Because we're going to talk about it this way, we've got capital on this axis, and it's all depreciating at the same rate, and that rate of depreciation is not impacted by output, but it's simply a variable of capital. For that reason, we draw depreciation as a straight line. Now, you've heard all this stuff about depreciation before, but I hope you're gaining a little bit deeper insight as to why we're modeling it the way that we're modeling it. It's a straight line. Why? Because it's only impacted by one of the variables here. Notice the rate of depreciation is constant. The slope of this is constant, as compared to output, along which the slope is constantly changing. It's constantly decreasing, asymptotically approaching zero. So then we take all three of these and throw them together, right? We take our aggregated savings, our aggregated GDPs, our aggregated depreciation, we throw them all in one graph. We got Y is some function of capital. Okay. We got savings is some function of output. We got depreciation is some function of capital. Okay. And what do we find? We find a point of equilibrium. Don't we? X marks the spot. X never marks the spot. X marks the spot. Go Indiana Jones, the Last Crusade there. Maybe this model belongs in the museum. But, okay, so, from this picture, how much are people consuming? What's the level of consumption in this model? It's the difference between this and this. Why do we have an equilibrium at this point? If the amount of capital were less than that, then the rate at which we were buying new units of capital will be greater than the rate at which the existing units of capital were wearing out, such that next year we've got more capital. And then here we're buying more than is wearing out, so next year we've got more capital. And here we're buying more than is wearing out, so we've got more capital. And here we're buying more than is wearing out, so we've got more capital. A little bit less than in past. Here the difference is really small, so we're only going to add a little bit more capital. And if we gravitate towards that equilibrium point. We don't get there right away. Right? The closer we are to it, the slower we're moving. That's interesting. The closer we are to that point, the slower we're moving towards it. How does that work? How many of you done this before? I'm going to walk halfway to the wall. I'm going to walk halfway to the wall again. I'm going to walk halfway to the wall again. When am I going to get to the wall? Never. I never get to the wall, do I? It depends. Parts of me might get to the wall before other parts of me get to the wall. Okay. Yeah, so that's what's happening here. It's an asymptotic kind of relationship. Similarly, if I started out with more capital here, then the rate at which my capital is depreciating is faster than the rate at which I'm buying new capital, so next year I'll have less capital. And again, my rate of depreciation is faster than my rate of purchasing, so I'll have less capital, and again, I asked the time to approach this point, and so we call that point the steady state. Level of capital. So given a particular function for output, given a particular expression for the savings rate, given a particular expression for the rate of depreciation, we can solve for what is called a steady state quantity of capital. And this is the rate at which capital will persist in a given economy. Now, what happens if there's a war? Suppose that when we were in an economy that had achieved its steady state level of capital, and then a war comes along, and so our foreign invaders destroy all our capital. Not all of it, but a lot. What happens? Has anything changed to the production function? No, nothing has changed to our production function. Has anything happened to the rate at which capital depreciates? No. Has anything happened to our savings rate? Initially, no. We're going to suppose that no. Okay, then. What about our marginal productivity? Has that changed? Given the amount of capital that we have, has the marginal productivity of capital changed? Well, sure. Before, when we were up here in our steady state, the marginal productivity of capital is the line that is just tangent to our production function. Here, the marginal productivity of capital is the line that is just tangent to our production function. And which economy has a higher marginal productivity of capital? This one. We're poorer, but the marginal productivity of capital is higher. Why? Because every remaining unit of capital is being used more intensively. Right? It's being more productive than it was before. Same is true for labor. Right? If you're in a war and you kill off half of your people, right? Then what would we expect to happen for the marginal productivity of each worker? If the amount of capital remains, then every worker has more capital to work with. Right? So then each worker becomes more productive. When each worker becomes more productive, their wages go up. So we saw in the plague in Europe that wages for the average worker went up. So much so that many people could escape from fiefdom. Right? And become yeomen, owning themselves and working for themselves because their wages have gone up by so much. Now, what's interesting is that the farther we get away from our steady state, right, we're going to start moving back towards our steady state right away. But when the farther we are from our steady state, the faster we are approaching our steady state again. The rate at which we are moving towards our steady state is fast. Just like the first time I walked halfway to the wall, I went a long distance. The second time I walked halfway to the wall, I walked a lesser distance, right? The closer we are to our steady state, the faster we're growing. So the rate of growth of an economy that finds itself on a particular production function but with less capital, the rate of growth of that economy is going to be faster. Closer you are to, well, if you're at your steady state, what happens to your rate of growth? At your steady state, you're not growing anymore. The marginal productivity of capital has not yet reached zero. It's still productive, but you're not growing anymore because the rate of depreciation is constraining you. Any questions about this so far? Is this good review? Hopefully you're understanding it a little bit deeper than the first time we went through it in intro. If you got questions, let me know. We'll do a little more of this on Friday. Thanks.